we've got to have a tolerance for failure, willingness to experiment. However, what it said is you have to marry that tolerance for failure with an intolerance for incompetence. When you ground creative work in behavioral truths, you design with the brain in mind. So the implications are that emotion is more powerful than logic. So I think the most valuable thing a brand can offer today is confidence in the decision, and ultimately really helping people, buyers, know they've made the right decision. Ultimately, the sort of shift from job title based hiring to skills based hiring. LinkedIn data shows that professionals entering the world of work today will hold twice as many jobs as someone starting 15 years ago.
Welcome to the AI Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Ashley Raganza, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jonathon Palmer from LinkedIn to this episode. Jonathon, before we go much further, could I ask you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about the area of LinkedIn, because I appreciate it's a big organization that you are responsible for, please.
Thanks, Ashley. Great to be here with you today. And so my role at LinkedIn is head of content solutions for EMEA and Latin America. I'm part of the LinkedIn marketing solutions line of business within LinkedIn. And myself and my team, we work with LinkedIn's most valuable customers to really help them show up in the best way possible on the platform through content strategy, advising them around how to build their brand on LinkedIn. We work a lot with executives who are looking to build their personal brand. And we are very much a cross-functional team that work closely with other teams in LinkedIn, and particularly with the sales organization, and spend a lot of time in the room with our customers, really consulting around all those different areas.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. This issue of creativity is where I'd really like to start our conversation, because everybody talks about, people having critical skills. And I think clearly that's important. But I think equally, being creative and being able to bring a level of creativity into the workplace and into business, I think is proving to be equally important. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit from your perspective about the role of creativity in businesses today.
Absolutely. It's been interesting to look at the World Economic Forum's take on this, and they've been pretty consistent over the last decade. I think every single future of jobs report they've called out creative thinking and analytical thinking. And I think for the last Future of Jobs report, creative thinking ranks number 2 overall. So that's ahead of leadership, communication skills, digital literacy. And the World Economic Forum really kind of thinks of it as 2 separate skills, that combination of creative thinking, analytical skills, but they call out that creative thinking is growing faster than almost any other cognitive skill. So, with AI, automation, there's a lot of standardization that's happening, that's taking those sort of routine tasks and those sort of analytical tasks. And so the competitive advantage is shifting towards the human capabilities that machines can't easily replicate. And it used to be there was the sort of common saying that ideas are cheap, execution is everything. And that's really been flipped. Now, today, AI makes execution simple, fast, easy. And today, ideas are everything. And the ability for a business to originate is hugely important. And so, big part of that is curiosity. Asking the right questions, asking questions nobody else is asking, the power of imagination, reframing problems. All of these things are incredibly important, particularly around sort of generating novel ideas. And in fact, LinkedIn did a survey of senior executives, and 57% of them rank creativity as the most important soft skill. And what all of this is telling us is that there's an expectation of creativity from everyone. It's not just the creative team. And that changes the game, because historically creativity has been it's lived within the R&D lab. or it's lived within a creative department or creative team. But what we're seeing with AI is it's putting these incredibly powerful creative tools in the hands of everybody. So there's a massive democratization of creativity taking place, which is really exciting. Everybody has the opportunity to contribute the ideas in their head and make them real. And that I think is, a fascinating time to be living in and working within. However, putting creative tools in the hands of everybody is easy, or certainly only part of it. Unlocking their creativity is hard, and there's tons of barriers to creativity, things like risk aversion, self-censorship, ingrained habits of efficiencies, and a lot of organizations has let creativity atrophy as a muscle within the business.
Jonathon, you've hit a really important point, which is, creativity is not the preserve of one or two departments, but is now becoming almost everyone's responsibility in an organization. How do people suddenly switch on this creativity?
That's absolutely right. It's the classic refrain of stop daydreaming, whereas actually daydreaming is plugging into your subconscious mind that's making all sorts of interesting connections there. So I think this is the challenge for organizations today in that I mentioned before, that sort of self-censorship, that unwillingness to share sort of half thought through ideas, that kind of intelligent risk taking, putting yourself out in a limb. So many sort of organizations don't reward that kind of behavior, and many organizations have been optimized for the rational, for the efficient. So I think it starts with leaders modeling this behavior themselves. Being willing to share with vulnerability an idea that's perhaps half baked, making room for and encouraging experimentation, and really giving people permission to share imperfect ideas. And at the heart of it, ultimately, companies need to create cultures and systems that unlock that creativity from every single corner in the organization. And perhaps the most important part of that is that aspect of building psychological safety in teams, because when you have that psychological safety, you give people permission to take risks, to challenge assumptions, to ask questions, even if they maybe will have to admit something they don't know without fear of embarrassment. To take risks without fear of punishment if some of those experiments go wrong, because when people feel safe, that's when the genuine creativity starts flowing. And innovation isn't just about giving them those talent or having the right talent and the right tools. It's a product of the environment they're operating in, where people feel free to imagine alternatives. So I think today organizations that embrace creativity as a cultural and operational principle will outperform in terms of adaptability, innovation, and growth.
But for a board or for senior managers to have everybody going out and being creative and coming up with many ideas, you can almost imagine senior managers being a bit concerned that they're going to be inundated with all these ideas and they can't necessarily say yes to all of them. How do organizations kind of balance this in terms of, on the one hand, encouraging this level of creativity and fresh ideas coming through, but also managing expectations in terms of because not everything can be funded.
The Harvard Business Review wrote a fascinating article based on an extensive study around this exact question. And what they found was that, there are a number of cliches when it comes to creativity. One of which is, we've got to have a tolerance for failure, willingness to experiment. However, what it said is you have to marry that tolerance for failure with an intolerance for incompetence. The two have to go together, because no business is in the business of failing. You can fail in service of the next success. So you have to marry that tolerance for failure with that focus on real strong competence. And similarly, that willingness to experiment needs to be matched with a rigorous discipline in terms of how those experiments are conducted and measured and evaluated. And the safety to speak up also needs to be combined with really brutal candor. I mean, if you look at organizations such as Pixar, and how they've revolutionized the creative process around how they make films. They have a brain trust, and they're extremely rigorous in terms of how they essentially sort of look at their output, pull it apart, and really make sure that it is of the highest standards. And similarly, where organizations are talking about being non-hierarchical, you have to have high individual accountability, and that strong leadership there as well. So yes, I think you, particularly when you're having that conversation with the board, you have to bring that commercial realism. And I think this is what we need to go beyond, is seeing creativity as something fluffy, and it should be somewhat fun. I believe that, but it has to be within the parameters of the commercial imperative of the organization, which is profit, ultimately growth, and many of those other sort of core things that the board have a fiduciary duty to advance.
Jonathan, could you elaborate a little bit about some of the changes that you have seen and experienced in terms of how the marketing area has changed?
So I think creativity's time has really come as far as marketing goes. Marketers have now more permission than ever to take intelligent creative risks. And there's been lots of research around the value of creativity. In fact, Kantar and Walk, a couple of research agencies, did some recent research that revealed that high quality creative in advertising drives 4 times the profit that low quality creative does. But despite the case for creativity being clear and the power of creativity, we have something of an attention crisis happening in B2B marketing. B2B Institute, which is LinkedIn's think tank in this area, actually conducted an extensive study around this using neurometric analysis. And what they found is that for the average ad, 81% of viewers could not remember having seen the ad or could not correctly identify the advertising brand. And given that there's 30 billion spent on B2B advertising in the US alone, that's a huge proportion of spend that's effectively wasted. And so, when we consider AI and we're seeing the increasing saturation of our feeds, then that challenge, that attention crisis, I think, is only going to get worse. So the business case is understood, but actually what isn't so well understood is how exactly you apply that creativity. And that's one of the things that we sought to address. And one of the things I've been fortunate enough to lead is Creative Labs, which is LinkedIn's global center of excellence around creativity. Really set up with the goal of elevating creativity as a competitive advantage, to really help brands and agencies see LinkedIn as a place for bold creative. And so it was all about blending the art and the science of creativity. So this kind of meeting of magic and logic, and we brought together these really diverse teams. We had content strategists, we had data and insights analysts, we had measurement teams, all working together to co-create frameworks and tools. And I think that's what we were allowed us to do, was to use LinkedIn's first party data to really prove out what creative works empirically on the platform. And this is the point with creativity. It has to be informed by insights, and it has to be in service of strategy.
Jonathan, based on that work that you've done, how does behavioral science and how can behavioral science be used to enhance creativity?
It's incredibly powerful, I think, in terms of the role of behavioral science in creativity. Marketers spend a lot of their time categorizing audiences into segments and personas, but actually, behavioral science gives us the most powerful insights because it helps us understand how all humans think. And when you understand those universal patterns of cognition, you can build marketing or creative that ultimately works with the grain of the human mind, not against it. And you're no doubt familiar with the work of Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work in behavioral economics. And he gave us this mental model, this idea of system one and system two thinking. System one being our kind of powerful, very fast, instinctive way of thinking. It kind of relates to our ancestral brain. And then system two is more slow and rational And the interplay between these two systems of thinking is ultimately how we navigate through the world. It's how we make decisions. And so understanding this really can help inform how we can be more creative and how we can communicate more effectively. And marketing's really kind of built its muscle around things like personas, demographic segments, firmographics, whereas behavioral science is much more around things like cognitive load, loss aversion, choice overload, social proof. And so everyone from the CEO through to 25-year-old marketer or a B2B buyer is subject to all of those different things. So I think we have to recognize that real world decisions are not really driven by personas. They're driven by mental shortcuts, these heuristics, because in the wild, people don't behave in that sort of neat way. And so the implications for creativity are that when you ground creative work in behavioral truths, you design with the brain in mind. So the implications are that emotion is more powerful than logic, something that's been overlooked in B2B for a long time. But emotional processing is done by system one. It's that processing is faster. Emotion plays a bigger role in creating memory structures as well, which is obviously the goal of any marketer. Simplicity beats completedness because we all have limited cognitive load. Distinctiveness beats persuasion because memory is highly selective, and so using distinctive brand assets consistently drives more memory. And interestingly enough, stories beat statistics because narrative is the kind of brain's compression algorithm, if you like. We're very much sort of hardwired to kind of respond to stories. So it's not an either or. I think it's about the blend of both that kind of traditional marketing way of thinking and weaving in more of the behavioral science side of things as well.
When you bring those together in the context of a brand, how is the very notion of brand beginning to change?
Yeah, I think we are at a very interesting time as far as brands go. If you kind of look in the past, you can see how the definition of brands has changed by different sort of marketing professors. Philip Kotler really kind of talked about how it was all about distinguishing names and symbols and the brand mark. Seth Godin talks about it from the point of view of it being a set of expectations and memories and stories that drive choice between one product or service. David Ogilvy kind of said it's really an amalgamation of all of these things, intangible sum of the attributes and packaging and price and so on. And actually, I think it's interesting to look at where we are today. I was doing a guest lecture and I showed them a series of logos. So I showed them McDonald's, Toyota, Apple. Of course, they knew all of those logos. And then I showed them the logo of ServiceNow and asked them if they knew which company ServiceNow was. None of them did. And it would be surprising if they did because it's a pure B2B brand. It's effectively kind of takes the drudgery out of modern workflows by automating those. But at the time, ServiceNow had a bigger market capitalization than Ford and Ferrari combined. And I think that's the fascinating thing about brands. And so where we are today, B2B is worth a massive $20 trillion, and it's one of the biggest drivers of growth in the world economy. And so today, many brands across B2C and B2B have this societal relevance. And so the notion of a brand has evolved, I think. If we look at the last 4 years, we've had the pandemic, massive geopolitical turbulence and economic turbulence as well. Obviously, AI is accelerating and changing many things. And so it's fundamentally changing how people think and feel about the brands and services and products they buy and work for. And so today, typically we've always thought about brand as from the point of view of it being for consumers. But actually, I think the reality is brand has to do so much more today. And when we look at the reality of brands on LinkedIn, we see that there's these three dimensions of a brand. You do have the consumer brand, which is business to business, and that's how customers and partners think and feel about your brand and your products and services. But we also have the corporate brand, which is business to society, to investors, to journalists, and positioning the company as a good corporate citizen. And then we have the talent brand, which is how current and future employees think and feel about your company as a place to work. And at the center of all of that is the brand DNA. And a unified brand is about when companies show up cohesively across all of those three dimensions. And ultimately, the most forward-thinking companies are those that have that brand DNA as the single organizing principle of the organization as well.
Great. And if that's where we've kind of got to with brands, how are brands likely to evolve going into the future?
I mean, if we just sort of look back, if you like, at how marketing has evolved, it's fascinating because I think you've seen a sort of shifting center of gravity as the role of brands has evolved and marketing has evolved. So we've gone from this sort of pre-World War II era, which could be sort of defined as the product era. This was all about function. So companies competed and won through superior marketing, through superior engineering, manufacturing, and reliability. And so this was sort of the era of better widgets. And then after World War One, we sort of moved into the a service era. So whereas before companies had competed around building a better product, what they realized was there was greater parity as far as products were going. And so brands would seek to differentiate through service. And so they wouldn't just build and deliver a washing machine, they'd install it as well. So brands became about that reliability and helpfulness. So brands like John Lewis, Xerox, which was not just copiers but maintenance contracts, and that was really sort of pre World War II through to the 1990s. Then we went in the 1990s to the sort of digital era, which was all about convenience and access, where the internet really commoditized products and services. It lowered the barriers to entry for companies, and digital transformation sort of raised expectations of convenience and always on support. So brands like Amazon, Salesforce, and so on. But of course, that then evolved. And then from the sort of 2010s into the 2020s, what really happened is things like comparison sites further eroded brand differentiation. And so brands started to differentiate through experiences. So brands like Airbnb, Uber, Shopify, and that became the era of better experiences. And then where we are today is fascinating time because I think again the sort of pandemic was this watershed moment around brands, and we've seen these changing geopolitical, economic landscape that's changed the operating environment for brands. And so I think today it's more around confidence, and the role of brands is about giving buyers confidence in a period of AI abundance and almost endless choice, and sort of velocity of decision making, the ambiguity that is in the online world. So I think the most valuable thing a brand can offer today is confidence in the decision, and ultimately really helping people buyers know they've made the right decision, but giving them that sense of certainty in an uncertain world as well.
Yeah, and the world of agentic AI is suggesting from all the research that is likely to lead to even more uncertainty, particularly in terms of jobs. And if the statistics are to be believed, a number of jobs, a number of people are going to be displaced from the roles they currently have, which in some ways means individuals kind of taking ownership of their personal brand. And I just wondered, Jonathon, what can individuals, what can people do to build and own their personal brand and kind of amplify their message, amplify their leadership abilities through their personal brand?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been interesting since the pandemic, we've seen this massive uptick in the role of leadership voice on the platform. In fact, there's been a 52% year-on-year increase in the CEOs posting on LinkedIn. And there's a number of ways that if you're an executive or really anyone can build your personal brand on LinkedIn. The first way is to update your profile page and to kind of think about your LinkedIn profile as your own personal landing page. So crafting an about section that really captures who you are as a leader. It speaks to your skill set, but it encapsulates what you stand for as a leader, perhaps touches on essentially a little bit of your personal, who you are as a person as well, because ultimately it's probably the first thing people will see, and ultimately people buy from people. People want to work with people. So having that good hygiene, if you like, for your profile, having the profile picture, having up-to-date experience, that's a really good foundation to start with. But next comes building a simple and consistent content strategy. So particularly for leaders that are looking to build an audience, aim to consistently post once a week if you can. And I would suggest starting by following other leaders, customers, colleagues, and when they post, leave comments, be part of the conversation, because they're likely to do the same to you when you start posting as well. And typically, people want to hear from subject matter experts and executives on three areas, and they want to hear about you, your industry, and your company. And so talking to those areas is really effective. But lean on your expertise to provide a unique point of view. Remember that what seems obvious to you won't to others. So focus on sharing your unique value, but tell your network what your company is doing
Mhm.
differently to the rest of the industry, what makes you proud of what you're working on, lessons you've learned on your career journey, anecdotes, for example, all work well. But don't be afraid to perhaps be more vulnerable on the platform as well, because people prefer vulnerability to that polished side of things as well. And then when it comes to formats, I'd say experiment with a few different formats. Video is very popular, and actually, we see video posts shared 20 times more than any other format on LinkedIn. And ultimately, I would say don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Really just focus on posting more than consuming, and learning as you go, experimenting and seeing what works.
Yeah, I mean, the whole area of work and the nature of work itself is changing. And I just wondered, from your perspective again, how do you see the future of work evolving?
I think obviously AI is playing a huge role in accelerating a lot of the changes that are happening within work. I think today 75%, last time I looked, of workers now use generative AI, and it's estimated that 70% of jobs will change by 2030. So the task of any employee, any leader, any company today is to become an AI first employee, leader, or company. That is without doubt. And that obviously has an impact on skills. But I also think we've seen a shift as a result of the pandemic to hybrid working. Expectations are around greater flexibility. So employers who embrace that hybrid working really extend the sort of pool of appropriate candidates. I think only 10% of job posts are remote, yet they receive almost half of all applications.
Mhm.
And just recognizing that today careers are non-linear, they're very much sort of chapter based.
Uh, and when you talk about careers and particularly people moving from one job to the other, how are hiring practices starting to change?
Yeah, so this is a shift we've been seeing for some time, is ultimately the sort of shift from job title based hiring to skills based hiring. And ultimately, for decades we've been relying on job titles and degrees as a shortcut for ability, but the labor market is changing so fast that's just not keeping up. And LinkedIn data shows that professionals entering the world of work today will hold twice as many jobs as someone starting 15 years ago. And we see many of the jobs that are on LinkedIn's jobs on the rise list didn't exist 20 years ago. And so LinkedIn has a really strong position that skills, not degrees, are the most reliable way to understand someone's potential. And so the platform is building out tools like skills match, skills assessment, things like economic graph insights to help employees and job seekers navigate that shift. But ultimately, I think it's not to say that a degree is no longer relevant. It's just it now needs to be augmented with that very deliberate, ongoing investment in keeping skills up to date. So employees and businesses have to remain adaptable, invest in lifelong learning, have that skills forward mindset. You're no doubt familiar with a book by Carol Dweck called Mindset, all about growth mindset. And I would say, Satya Nadella really has been a massive proponent of this book within Microsoft, and it's been credited with really helping to secure LinkedIn's or Microsoft's position as one of the leading technology businesses. So it's because skills-based hiring is becoming much, much more important in that way.
That's really interesting, particularly when you think of how AI is likely to impact roles, particularly first tier entry level roles. Again, a lot of the research says that those roles are going to go. And I just wonder, what can people who are starting out on their careers, what can they do to ensure that they can get on that first rung in order to build their careers? Because quite frankly, if you're not on the first rung, where do you go? And this is a significant, or has the potential of being a significant societal issue in due course.
Absolutely. I think, keeping on with the conversation around skills, it is investing in developing the right skills. And so while technical skills are part of it and learning the right AI skills are absolutely critical, actually learning some of those soft skills, and in particular, I would say social intelligence is absolutely essential. So in the past, you may have been able to succeed with having that technical brilliance, but I think today you're going to need that social brilliance to really thrive in the modern workplace. But undoubtedly, I think we're at a place where perhaps for the first time, we're going to see four generations working side by side, from Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, and boomers. But there's no question that Gen Z are entering a workforce at a very difficult time. We are seeing it's a very competitive job market. There's fewer entry level roles. Confidence among Gen Z is at the lowest of any generation. But despite this, Gen Z are adapting fast. So we're seeing hyper mobility. The average tenure is 1.1 years compared to 2.8 years in the first 5 years of employment for Gen X. They're looking at side hustles and gig pathways. But I would say, in addition to learning new skills, it's critical to leverage tools like LinkedIn. And I talk to students every year about how to use LinkedIn to give them the best chance of really landing that first job. And one of the things I talk to them about is building a network of luck. There's a great book called The Luck Factor by Dr. Richard Wiseman, who really looked at the factors of what makes someone lucky. And what he identified was that actually lucky people have a really big network. And it's just a question of mathematics, probability. The more connections you have in the network, the more chance you have of that serendipitous connection being able to connect you with the opportunity you're looking for. So being really deliberate about developing your network, connecting with professors at universities, using the LinkedIn alumni tool to look at who else has been to your university or educational institution that are in the sorts of companies you want to work for now. And I would also say many of the things I talked about earlier around building your personal brand. So having the right sort of profile on LinkedIn, linking that to keywords. So you can use an AI tool, grab a load of the sort of job descriptions that you're looking for, those sorts of jobs, identify the common keywords and make sure that you're including those in your about section so that it will be indexed by recruiters looking to hire people in that particular industry. And then thinking about the value that you can give through your content so that you're regularly popping up in your network, and any recruiters checking you out on the platform will see you've got the great experience, see you have an interesting point of view, and we'll ultimately hire you because you're ticking the right boxes there.
Jonathon, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your insights, and some really practical tips for what people can do who are likely to be impacted by the advance of AI. And some of that impact is clearly going to be very positive because people can use these technologies to help them in their career and help them progress through their career. And equally, I think you've given some really good tips and guidance for what people can do to help position themselves best in terms of going forward. So thank you so much for joining the AI Adoption Podcast.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Absolute pleasure, and great to talk with you here today.